All right, opening question. Is there a eulogy that stands out in your memory as best capturing a remarkable life?
Wow.
Can use
Whoa.
more.
Could
Yeah.
you ease us in a little bit more? Well, I did hear a eulogy, man named Ross Gelbspan, who was he was a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, a lot on civil rights and racism. That's what he won his Pulitzer Prize for. Then he was an editor of the Globe for a long time, and then he became very involved in the environment. And my husband gave a eulogy for him, and it was hard to sum him up, but he was this man for this generation, which I think is very appropriate for today's Parsha. It's such a force, the way he did it, his presence, his ability not just to communicate through the word, but through writing, but as his presence. His presence. And so Mike summed this up, and at the very end, he used the Shakespearean, and the rest is silence.
Mm.
And for me, that was wonderful, because the greatest praise is there are no words. There's nothing more to say.
I have one that I went to a funeral recently of Carol Nesson, who was one of the founding members of the West Roxbury Chavurah, which the Chavurah eventually joined the synagogue in the late 1980s and really revived Hillel B'nai Torah at the time. And the eulogy was given by her son, Bill Young, who is currently, actually he and his family are members of our synagogue. So I was there sort of for two reasons. One, that I was a good friend of Carol, and one, to support a family in our synagogue. And what I thought was remarkable about his eulogy was that he did list all her various accomplishments. She was a great friend and leader of West Roxbury Friends of Rosie's Place. She was an attorney that both battled with City Hall and also supported and defended City Hall. So in terms of Boston politics, she was very active. She was very active politically for various social justice causes. But he also captured her as a mother and as a grandmother and as a friend, and talked about when you walked into her kitchen, there was always incredible chocolate chip cookies and pies to eat. And she had this very open, hospitable way of being, so that you always felt welcomed, whether you were a friend, a colleague, a book club member, whatever role it is that you played in her life. So something not as great as a Moses or this remarkable person that Deborah just spoke about, but somebody who's kind of closer to us, that more relatable maybe. And it was very moving, and he spoke for a good, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes, and everybody was just absolutely listening. Like you couldn't, that expression, you couldn't hear a pin drop. Absolutely captivated by how he really was able to capture his mother, and it was incredibly moving.
Mm. Thank you. Sounds like a remarkable woman, and how lovely to hear the tribute coming from her son. I will just chime in with a brief story about a work colleague of mine whose father passed away, and the granddaughter spoke at the funeral, and her eulogy was centered around a story, remembering what it was like for her to be a young girl and to go to her grandfather's house and spend the night and wake up in the morning, and the grandfather would always create this sumptuous breakfast of bacon and eggs and potatoes. And she remembered one time she had a habit of saving her bacon for the end because she was a great lover of bacon. And her grandfather watched this habit of hers. And at the end, as she was about to take, the bite of her bacon, her grandfather swooped in and took the bacon and ate it. And she said, "Grandpa, why did you do that? I was saving the best for last." And he said to her, "You should not save the best for last."
Mm.
And it was just such a beautiful message at a funeral about carpe diem. Yes,
I
ma'am.
have one little one, which is, it was actually something that I read in a New York Times obituary, the paid notices of somebody, I have no idea who they were. But it was about a couple who loved each other incredibly, and were just so devoted to each other. And the woman had passed away and her husband had passed away before. And in this little notice, they said, must have been the children, said, should they meet in the afterlife, their delight in seeing each other will only be rivaled by their disappointment in their belief in atheistic beliefs.
I love it.
I just thought it was a wonderful vision.
Yeah. That's funny.
Think of eulogies that upset me. Where I didn't recognize the person that was being eulogized, who, and one that really upset me was when my mother passed away. My mother passed away Erev Pesach. And the rabbi that my father called upon knew my parents, but all he talked about, it was like he went to his files and pulled out somebody who died Erev Pesach. I was so upset that when my father passed away after that, my sister and I put together a tribute really to both my parents. And I finally felt that I had paid proper tribute to my mother.
When my mother died, this isn't exactly what you're asking for, but it's the eulogy I remember best.
Yes.
The rabbi who did her eulogy was the rabbi of my brother's synagogue. And he knew my mother a little bit, but he sat and talked with us for a couple of hours. And what I really valued about this eulogy is that rather than canonizing my mother, he captured who she was. Her good points, her flaws, and in his eulogy, she came to life for me. And he did not try to canonize her. And I was forever grateful because my mother had a very difficult life. And it took its toll on her. And she was not someone to be canonized.
Yeah.
And he did a beautiful and respectful eulogy of her that included all that. I mean,
Yeah.
he really heard what we said to him.
Yes. I think the tension in many eulogies is to try to lift up the wonderful parts of the person, to sand off the rough edges of their difficulties and figure out a graceful way to be true to the person, but also kind of speak to their best qualities. But if it can be authentic to who the person is and really capture some of the warts, and Annette, I think your story really talks to that. Okay, so Parshat Chukhat begins with the law of the red heifer, the ashes of which could purify anyone who became ritually impure through contact with a corpse. The red heifer is a classic example of a chok, a biblical commandment with no apparent meaning. Miriam dies and is buried without a public mourning period. Immediately thereafter, the Israelites lose their source of water and start grumbling against Moshe and Aharon. God commands Moshe to talk to the rock so it will produce water. Moshe suddenly scolds the people and strikes the rock, and instead of talking to it. As a result, God announces to Moshe and Aharon that they will not enter the promised land. Moshe sends emissaries to the king of Edom, asking for permission to cross through their territory. He is refused. Aharon dies on Mount Hor, and the people observe a 30-day mourning period, the first Shloshim. So remarkably, Moshe loses both his siblings in the same parsha. The Israelites battle the Canaanites, And then another episode of strife with the people against God. God sends serpents to strike them. God tells Moshe to mount a copper serpent on a stick, and all those who gaze upon it will be healed. More wanderings with an obscure song sung to a well that echoes the song of the sea. Battles against the two most powerful kings in the region, Sichon, the king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan. Finally, the people arrive in the plains of Moab, across the Jordan from Jericho, which later will be the site of their first battle in the Promised Land. So truly a Parsha jam-packed and eventful. In liturgical time, last weekend, we ushered in the month of Tammuz. We're slowly making our way towards the penitential season. In 10 days, we will observe the fast of the 17th of Tammuz, which commemorates the fall of the walls of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. 3 weeks after that, we reach Tisha B'Av, and then 9 weeks later, Rosh Hashanah. So it's kind of just around the corner, even though it's a little ways away. And by way of backdrop, we are in the thick of the narrative of the wanderings through the wilderness. Knowing how this will end, we feel the sand running through the hourglass of Moshe's life and leadership. So I'd like to go to the heart of the incident of Moshe striking the rock. God tells Moshe to talk to the rock to get the water out of it, and we pick up the narrative in Numbers 20:10. Nancy, do you want to read that section, Numbers 29 through 12?
Moses took the rod from before Adonai as he had been commanded. Moses and Aharon assembled the congregation in front of the rock and said to them, "Listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock?" And Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. Out came copious water, and the community and their beasts drank. But Adonai said to Moses and Aharon, "Because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I have given them."
Okay, thank you. All right, so as an initial note, I want to place this in time. Okay, so this is in the 40th year following the Exodus. So we fast forwarded to the end of the journey. A couple of parshiot earlier was the incident of the spies, and that was at the beginning. And so the chronology really fast forwards to the end, 38 years later, after the sending the spies. So the people who Moshe has assembled in front of him at the rock are the children of the generation that died in the desert. And so Moshe hears the grumbling from this new generation and his hopes that these children born into freedom would not be carrying the baggage of their parents are dashed. And they're equally prone to doubt and rebellion. So we have Moshe, he's 120 years old. What are the signs in this passage that maybe he doesn't have the energy for the task?
The impatience. I mean, he has been through this twice before. I think he's just exhausted.
Where do you see it?
I see it in that he strikes the rock. But I also wanted to pose the fact that he says we instead of God is going to bring the water out. That's
a good question. Let me just confirm that. Hamina Salazet note C.
Note C,
Right.
right.
That we will deliver water for you.
Right. So another sign of age, if you will, is that he's got, he's a modest man most of his life, but now he's just, look, I've been through this over and over again. I'm in a partnership with God here. Hey, look, I'm this old. I've earned this and I'm just impatient and it's we,
Yeah.
I've done all this.
Yeah, that's a good that you picked up on the we. Yes, Annette.
I think it's unclear, given the sentence before, whether the we refers to God or to Aaron. Moses and Aaron assembled the congregation in front of the rock, and he said to them, "Listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock?"
That's a good point. I think in either event, it's either Moshe putting himself equivalent to God as like, I'm doing this, or completely removing God from the equation, and it's Moshe and Aaron. But your point's well taken, that's an ambiguity in the text. What else do we see in the text here? Yes, Jamil.
The raising of the hand feels like an impulsive action, not a considered or intentional action. He raises his hand, right?
Yes,
How I read it.
nice. What else?
Yeah, is there significance in the fact that he struck the rock twice? To me, shows anger, frustration.
And in a way, the interval between the strikes could also speak volumes. Striking twice immediate succession is even more frustration. Striking the rock the second time when no water came out the first time maybe shows desperation, so a little bit unclear there. Merle.
There's something that struck me when you were pointing out that this was a generation that hadn't come out of Egypt. This is the one that was born in the desert and didn't know Egypt. Yet their complaints were, why did you take us out of the place where there's no grain? Like they were extolling the beauties of Egypt. So the whole experience is coming to the next generation too. We haven't freed ourselves yet. We're not free. We're still looking for something that was.
Yeah.
Forgetting that what was slavery.
Yes. Nice. So let me mention one other thing that's subtle in here, which is that Jamil pointed us to the verb vayoram, and he raised.
Yeah.
The word for striking, vayach, is the same verb that was used for striking dead the Egyptian taskmaster when Moses was a young prince. And just as a moment of Moshe being out of control, coupled with striking the rock twice, this is a man who's lost his patience. And the last thing that I will say is he says, Shim'u na hamorim, listen, you rebels. And so this is completely gratuitous. He's asked to speak to the rock. He's supposed to sit down and speak to the rock. And he turns and addresses the people, and he slanders them. And so this is a situation where Moshe feels out of control in his leadership position.
I can't help feeling that this is a segue to a conclusion where God denies Aaron and Moses the entry to the land. And this is a kind of a justification. It's not just about Moses. It's somehow prefiguring the result. It's a very brief moment that after Moses has done so very much, that purports to justify the exclusion from the land. And I wonder if you could just speak to its narrative function here, as well as to the literal moment that we see.
Well, you're raising a really interesting point, Jamil, and I won't be able to do it full justice and sort of continue on, but I'm glad you raised it. I'll speak to it briefly. So the sentence 12, Adonai says to Moshe and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people, therefore you shall not lead this congregation. The question so there it is, right? This is like, because you did this, this is the result. But I think one of the troubling aspects of this passage is, to what extent is this truly the linear narrative here? Is this the true story that for losing his cool in this moment, once an entire lifetime of achievement, right, is obliterated? And really, the rabbis struggle with this. And I think the better way to read this is that Moshe was 120 years old and is not the leader for the next stage. And we're going to talk about that issue. His time was up. And to cast this as the result of this violation by him is really unfair to Moshe, is really sad, and is not, I think, the best way to read this. Well, so thank you for raising that. This thing here that says, you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity, there's a lot of, battle with the rabbis as to kind of what this means. And was this about what Moshe said, calling them rebels? Was this about what Moshe did, striking the rock. But here's the next sentence. You did not affirm my sanctity. The very next sentence, you did not affirm my sanctity. These are the waters of Meribah, meaning that the Israelites quarreled with Adonai, whose sanctity was affirmed through them. So verse 12 says, you did not affirm my sanctity. And verse 13 says, God's sanctity was affirmed. Vayikadesh bam. Vayikadesh, sanctity, bam, through them. Now this is an ambiguous phrase. Vayikadesh bam, this whose sanctity was affirmed through them. And rabbis kind of like go back and forth. What does it mean in the very next sentence to do this 180 to go from you didn't sanctify me to someone was sanctified? So Chizkuni and Rashbam, they take a very literal approach. What they basically say is Moshe's in front of the people, Moshe strikes the rock, the water comes out. The people don't know the backstory that Moshe was supposed to talk to the rock. And therefore, in front of the people, there's this miracle, the water comes out. And so they take a very literal approach. There's another guy, Tur Ha'aroch. He gives us a very technical reading. And Debbie, you talked earlier about the fact that Moshe has already gotten water out of a rock. If you look at the earlier incident in Exodus, that actually happens before the leaders only, not the whole people. And Tur Ha'aroch says that God was sanctified before the people because this incident of the rock happened in front of everyone. So he's got kind of tunnel vision, very technical reading. Rashi and Ibn Ezra say, look, these prior explanations don't account for the 180. What Rashi and Ibn Ezra say is that the punishment of Moshe and Aharon affirmed that God is supreme and that no leader is the equivalent. And leaders come and leaders go, and they have to be of the moment. This was no longer going to be Moshe's moment.
Rich, it's not just Moshe's time that's up, but notice the siblings are gone. There is a whole generation of leadership
Yes.
that has been replaced, Aaron, etc.
Yes.
Just one last little point. I love Jonathan Sacks. And thing he mentions was that let's remember he is in mourning for the sister he has just lost, who may in fact be responsible, in effect, because when she dies, so does the well that accompanies them.
Right.
And that is in deep mourning for the woman, this courageous woman. She's as much responsible for the fact that he's standing there doing this as anybody.
Sacks, thank you. Sacks speaks very eloquently about Moshe being in mourning. The Torah, a woman's commentary, has a very beautiful and insightful drash on this word here that I am circling, hamorim, which is the word, you rebels, that Moshe hurls at the people. And the letters for hamorim are the same letters as
Miriam.
Miriam. And so he had Miriam on the mind. And not only that, but there was no mourning for Miriam. She dies and is gone from the scene. So, there's kind of unexpressed grief. Jamil?
Building on Deborah's comment with Jonathan Sacks, it almost calls for some empathy here. And as a child, as an adolescent, I found the strictness of the punishment rather than some empathy for the moment and forgiveness. It affected my own relationship to Judaism. And it was something that continues to trouble me, that this is a moment where I would ask of a God, that the God be more kind and generous to someone who has accomplished so much.
I appreciate what you said. A lot of the themes that have been raised here and about the kind of difficulty of this punishment. I want to move us along because I want to talk about Moshe's successor, because I do think what Jamil talked about earlier, that the framing of this is punishment as opposed to, isn't this a natural successorship? And Debbie's point that, aren't we talking here about a whole generation of leadership that is now transitioning? Let's talk about the successor. So Moshe's successor is Joshua, right? And Joshua, we first meet on Mount Sinai. Moshe's going up the mountain. And here's says, come up to me on the mountain and wait here, and I will give you the stone tablets with the teachings and the commandments which I've inscribed to instruct them. So Moshe and his attendant Joshua arose, and Moses ascended the mountain of God. So Joshua goes halfway up the mountain. Rashi says, I'm not sure in what capacity Joshua appears here, but I think as a disciple, he was accompanying his teacher as far as the place where the bounds of the mountain were marked out, whence onward he was not permitted to proceed. And Joshua pitched his tent there and stayed during the whole 40 days, which Moshe was up on the mountain. And I want to point out, Misharatav is a very interesting word because it can mean anything from his chief officer to his valet. And in a way, Joshua kind of served all of this. The thing that really illustrates transition of leadership is the incident of the spies. So this is a few parshiot back. Remember, at the beginning of the wanderings, at the beginning, Adonai spoke to Moses saying, send agents to scout out the land of Canaan, which I'm giving to the Israelite people. Send one participant from each of their ancestral tribes, each one a chieftain. So Moshe, by God's command, sent them out from the wilderness of Paran, all of them being men of consequence. And then they list the men. I'm skipping those verses. Then we go to Moshe's instructions. When Moses sent them to scout the land of Canaan, he said to them, go up there into the Negev, out into the hill country, and see what kind of country it is. Are the people who dwell in it strong or weak, few or many? Is the country in which they dwell good or bad? Are the towns they live in open or fortified? Is the soil rich or poor, wooded or not? Take pains to bring back some of the fruit of the land. Now it happened to be the season of the first ripe grapes, and they went up, scouted the land from the wilderness of Tzin to Rehov at Lebo Hamath. Those are the instructions. And now I'm going to give you the narrative from the beginning of the book of Joshua, because Joshua sends out spies. Right now,
Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 men from Shittim as spies, saying, go reconnoiter the region of Jericho. So they set out, and they came to the house of a certain prostitute named Rahab and lodged there.
that's it.
Yeah.
Look at the difference between those two narratives. So let's just talk about for a second, what's the difference between that first incidence of sending the spy and this second one?
First of all, it's secret.
One, it's secret. Good.
And
What else?
there's only 2, and you don't know anything about them.
So they're secret. There's 2 of them. What else?
And they go to a whorehouse.
They go to a whorehouse. Okay. By the way, there's a dispute as to whether Zonah is whorehouse or not, but actually, I think the better reading is that, but there's a different reading that says an innkeeper. Okay, but a whorehouse or an innkeeper, both are a place where gossip is like happening and like everybody knows the town's business. But anyway, okay. So what's the significance of 2 people?
That it's not the heads of all the tribes.
And so
It's who it isn't, is significant.
keep going. Well, so what's the danger of sending 12 poobahs on the mission as opposed to these 2 people?
Is how how the message will be received.
How about managing the
There-
egos?
There's
Go
also,
ahead.
if you're sending 12 leaders, they're really to report back to their people. Whereas you're sending 2 people secretly, you're reporting back to the leader. The function and the passage of the message and to whom the message is directed has become very different. This is no longer a people who have to be persuaded in their tribes. This is a people led by a leader.
Yeah, good, good. Yeah, but much less likely to have the egos of these 12 also kind of intervene, right? And they're not necessarily following the leader's mission. And 12 is harder to manage than 2, right?
There's one
Yes.
other point, Rich, about sending who represents whom. He sends 2 spies of the people, right?
Yeah,
So it's of that, I'm assuming it's of that, not only of that generation, but that they're going to be attuned to they know to go where to hear the the gossip, which is the truth, the leaders will not be so attuned.
I'm overwhelmed and I'm debating whether to say this, but this whole section is so analogous to what is going on now with leadership. When to go get out, when you're desperate, and at the end, it may not be the best time to hold on to leadership. And these spy things are like the modern polls, you know, where you
Oh,
can get,
interesting.
you know, if you want to find out something, you can consult polls, but there's polls that say everything, and you can pick your poll to prove your point.
Yeah,
And you know, I can't help thinking about what's going on in our country right now.
yeah.
Read what, you know, the leadership of Moses and Aaron, the whole thing.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Thing.
Parshat Chukhat is just, it's like a
I mean,
magnet.
there's so much.
Yeah. It's a magnet this week. And I want to try to like pull us away from that magnetic field, and you're right to comment on it. So I'm going to ask you a question. These two men that Joshua sent are not identified. There's a midrash that talks about who those two people were. From what you know of the Torah narrative, who, if you were Joshua, would be the two people you would send who you could trust with this mission?
A priest?
No, I'm talking now specific names, not generic.
Oh,
In the incident of the spies, two of the spies remained faithful. One was Joshua. The other was Caleb.
yeah.
He chose Caleb. That was one. The second one, he chose a zealot. Who did
Oh,
he choose?
chose Pinchas.
He chose Pinchas. So the midrash is that he selected very carefully people who were going to be on mission. His buddy from the incident of the spies 38 years before, who he knew would be true, and the spear-throwing Pinchas. If you know the story, a couple of parshiot hence, the guy's a maniac, although God loves him. I highlight that because we've talked about what Joshua did in his sending of the spies versus what Moshe did. So if you're going to summarize, what was Joshua good at?
He was more practical.
Practical, tactical,
Yeah.
and the mission of conquering the land, which was kind of the next step. Joshua was a field commander, and he knew how to go into battle. So one thing I want to just note, and that is, in thinking about Joshua being the superior commander, Joshua was there at the original incident of the spies, and he was 56 years old, and he was Moshe's like chief aide de camp. Joshua owns the mistake the first time around because he was there and he was a chief advisor. And I think part of what's going on with Joshua is not just that he was inherently a better commander, but he had experienced the failure of doing this the wrong way. So I just want to point that out, that some of what's going on here is education, is maybe mentorship. I want to close us with the end of the Torah. These are the final verses of the Torah. Lori, could you read those?
Moses went up from the steppes of Moab to Mount Nebo to the summit, and Adonai showed him the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim, and Manasseh, the whole land of Judah, as far as the western sea, the Negev and the plain, the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. And Adonai said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will assign it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you shall not cross there." So Moses, the servant of Adonai, died there in the land of Moab at the command of Adonai. And God buried him in the valley in the land of Moab near Beit Peor, and no one knows his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were undimmed and his vigor unabated. And the Israelites bewailed Moses in the steppes of Moab for 30 days. The period of wailing and mourning for Moses came to an end. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands upon him. and the Israelites heeded him, doing as Adonai had commanded Moses. Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom Adonai singled out face to face for the various signs and portents that Adonai sent him to display in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all of his courtiers and his whole country, and for all the great might and awesome power that Moses displayed before all Israel.
Okay, thank you. The thing that I want to point us to is there is something puzzling about this passage. What is puzzling about this passage? I'm going to focus you on verse 5. Moshe, the servant of Adonai, died there in the land of Moab at the command of Adonai. Who wrote
Yeah,
the verses after verse 5? Moshe's dead, and Moshe typically is the one who is the transcriber of the Torah. And so we've got a question buried in here about who wrote these. So there's various midrashim about this, about how God dictated the Torah to Moshe, and Moshe wrote it with his tears. But there's a very beautiful midrash. Moshe, the servant of the Lord, died there. Is it possible that Moshe died and he himself wrote and Moses died there? Rather, Moshe wrote the entire Torah until this point, and Joshua wrote from this point forward. And so the way to read these final verses according to that midrash is this is Joshua's eulogy for Moshe. And this is where, particularly with the incident of the spies or the incident of the rock, this is in the context of that eulogy. What do you say about Moshe? How do you put the life in context? And is there anything other than, Annette, you talked about it as canonization or hagiography, right? It's, what do you say to summarize this life to give due deference to this man who is truly a hero and may have had a moment where, it was his time to move on, and he had to move on. But Joshua, who is maybe the person who knew him best, who is still alive, was able to pen those words and give proper honor to his mentor.
No, I was just things that struck me about the end of the Torah there. So one, is it possible to say that God has Moses dictates to him his own death, what will happen, in the future, and that Moshe has to, transcribe all of that, sort of knowing his own end.
Yes.
Another is that just struck by so many things that God commands Moshe's death. Is there another passage other than, say, for punishment or something where that is said, and then that God personally buries Moshe, the anonymity of the grave, which makes me think of, and the whole tenor of this passage seems to be, it is God's sort of greatness and power that has been infused into Moshe when it was his time. Now that has been passed to Joshua. It's not really about those human leaders. It's
Right.
God is with this person.
Yeah.
So it all seems to say it's, the passing of the baton is not as important, not important who's receiving it, but the fact that, God is with whoever that
Yeah.
is. And we are
Absolutely.
not to idolize Moshe.
Right.
Not,
Right.
his grave is not to be, a shrine. So
Yes.
those are things that struck me.
Yes, and those are all wonderful. Goes back to that point about God being sanctified by Moshe having to pass the baton, because it's not about the individual leader as well.
Right.
By the way, the Hebrew that talks about Moshe died at the mouth, at the word of Adonai, it says Al Pi Adonai, and the Midrash says that God gave him a divine kiss for his death. But I love this notion that you're highlighting that all the things that you highlighted, including that Moshe might have had his own death dictated to him by God, and he's sitting there writing his future. But anyway, lovely. Thank you. Good. Jamil.
Go
A
ahead.
different way, building on what Josh said, a different way to say it is that Moses, through God, wrote his own epitaph, and through God saying, "Don't look back at me, look forward to the land. I am not the one to worship. I have led you through this thing, but you are now moving on." So rather than this being a eulogy, this might be an epitaph that he writes as an instruction, or God writes through Moses as instruction to the people to move forward, not to look back, not to worship the man who led them there, but to move forward. His grave is gone.
Yeah, nice. I like eulogy versus epitaph is a really nice way to frame it too. Thank you for that point. We see this in this parsha, the beginning of the end of Moshe's leadership. In a sense, all three of these remarkable siblings pass from the scene of this parsha, though Moshe will linger for a while before he departs. Why does Moshe's leadership have to end? The departure of the only leader these people have ever known is scary and sad. What will come next? And yet the successor has been waiting patiently in the wings, halfway up the mountain, faithfully remaining in the tent of meeting. When called upon, he will step up and prove to be a great leader in his own right. And he knows the debt he owes to his mentor, and in his honor gives proper homage to his and our greatest teacher with a stirring eulogy that bridges Moshe's book and his. In a similar vein, the Talmud says that Moshe's face was radiant like the sun, and Yehoshua's face was radiant like the moon. Moshe's light shone forward and illuminated Joshua, and so it illuminates us down through the ages in the radiance of the Torah. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Yasher koach.
Thank you,
Thank you
Rich,
so much for
everybody.
this.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and Shabbat shalom, and thanks for joining.
Thank you.
But shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Rich.
Bye-bye.